This is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560. The Answer.
Good morning, Dan and Amy. Amy, you have two sons, Peyton and Eli.
I sure do.
Yeah.
12 and 13.
How they doing? They motivated? They achieving? They centered? Focused? Are they killers?
They're straight A students. One's a little motivated to play video games, and the other one does not like technology, is more into the sports once they have a ball in his hand.
All right.
I do struggle on Sundays to get them to go to church, but I think every parent has to deal with that. But that's all right.
I think it has to do with that cult that you go to.
We
that you call it church. So it's interesting because this is a big issue, and I got this recommendation from Neil Fagan, who's the headmaster at Northridge Prep.
Oh yeah.
And as a Catholic school kid, I'm conditioned to do whatever a headmaster at a Catholic school says. So he said, "You got to read Boys Adrift by this Dr. Leonard Sachs." Right. So I did, and now I'm saying, per the headmaster at Northridge Prep, don't take my word for it. You have to read it too. We're pleased to be joined by Dr. Sachs. The book, Boys Adrift, The 5 Factors Driving the Growing Epidemic of Unmotivated Boys and Underachieving Young Men. The 5 topic areas: video games, teaching methods, prescription drugs, environmental toxins, and the devaluation of masculinity. We won't be able to get to all of those, but I wanted to start with something that's later on in the book, in a chapter called The Revenge of the Forsaken Gods, where you recount an anecdote that the takeaway is, to be a man, a boy must see a man. And I wonder about the nature and structure of the family with the very high illegitimacy rates across demographics in this country in this day and age, and how much that has to do with the problems with young boys. They don't see men, Dr. Sachs.
Well, it gets complicated. When you look at the data, not every boy raised with a father does better than every boy, does better or worse, for that matter, than boys raised without fathers. One good example is Barack Obama, who was not raised by his father. He was raised by a single mom. He has a half-brother who was raised by his father, and his half-brother has had a terrible life and has been in and out of psychiatric institutions and is just a mess because his father was abusive.
Well, sure.
So being raised by an abusive father turns out not to be a good thing. It gets complicated, and there's a lot going on here. When you look across cultures, you find that across Western cultures, that boys increasingly are being raised without fathers, but there's tremendous variation from one culture to the next in terms of how boys are doing. So I don't think that the trend away from the two-parent household can explain the increasing disengagement of American boys.
Well, I'm not saying it explains all of it, but but I assume you're not saying that 70% plus illegitimacy rate in the black community, 50% Hispanic, 40% white, the lack of male figures in the lives of young men and children generally, excluding abusive parents, obviously, that is not without impact.
No, for sure. That's part of the story.
So the other part of the story that I wanted to make sure we get of these categories, teaching methods. What's the problem in this topic area with respect to young boys?
Well, I was visiting a high school, and 10th grade English, the assignment was to write about whatever you want, and a boy chose to write about the Battle of Stalingrad, winter 1942, from the perspective of a Russian soldier. And the Russian soldier's on patrol. He's ambushed by a German soldier, and he fires his rifle at point-blank range into the face of the German soldier, and then describes what happens when you fire your rifle at point-blank range at another man's face. What happens is that the head explodes, and a piece of brain goes one way, a piece of chin goes another way, an eyeball goes another way. This boy was suspended from school, and the parents were told he would not be allowed to return until they had obtained an evaluation by a licensed professional who would have to write a letter on stationery assuring the school that the boy posed no imminent danger to himself or to others. And when the parents shared that story with me, it really struck a chord because I wrote a similar story myself 40 years ago. I was attending public high school outside Cleveland, Ohio, and my English teacher nominated me for a competition, National Council of Teachers of English, and they said, here's a blue book, you have 45 minutes to write a story. And I wrote a story about East German refugees trying to escape to West Germany across the minefield, and one of them steps on a mine which blows off his left leg to the hip and his right leg to the knee, and he's crawling west across the minefield and finally makes it to the border and is picked up by the West German border guards, and he dies. And my own mom died in September 2008, and going through her papers after her death, I found that she had kept the certificate sent to our home by the National Council of Teachers of English, awarding me their highest honor in creative writing.
Well, yeah, I mean,
Steve, boys have always written about traumatic amputation and violent death. Boys doing things that boys have always done.
So should
at one another, saying "bang bang, you're dead," writing stories about traumatic amputation and violent death, drawing a picture of a weapon can now get you a discipline referral. And the unintended result is that many boys now regard academic achievement and working really hard to get a better grade as unmasculine. It's not true of all boys, but it's true of a growing proportion of boys.
So I assume Stephen Crane's Red Badge of Courage will have to be removed from high school English classes.
Well, indeed, and I've had just this conversation with school leaders and administrators because they'll say, "Well, we don't want to condone violence, so we don't want boys to write stories where people get killed violently." And I say, "Okay, let me ask you a question. Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, are boys allowed to read War and Peace or Crime and Punishment?
Or the Bible.
Or the Brothers Karamazov?
The Bible's pretty violent, too.
And indeed, Genesis chapter 4, Cain murders his brother Abel. Are boys allowed to read these books? And if the answer is yes, then my question is, okay, if boys are allowed to read stories of violent death and murder, why are they not allowed to write such stories? What's the explanation there? In fact, we have good evidence that the underlying assumption is that if boys write violent stories, that they are more likely, in fact, to engage in violence. We have very good evidence that that assumption is mistaken. It's simply not true. As long as the violence is in bounds means that the violence is generic and classic. It's intrinsic to that genre of writing. If you're writing a story about Roman gladiators, there will be blood and battle axes and decapitations. But we know that boys who write such stories are not more likely to be agents of actual violence. On the other hand, boys who write stories of personal and threatening violence, if a boy writes a story about bringing a knife to school to stab another boy whom he names, and there is such a boy at the school who's been making fun of him, that's personal, that's threatening, and that boy actually is at increased risk to be an agent of violence. That's unusual. But if teachers care about preventing actual violence, they need to understand that difference. The majority of boys writing violent stories are writing generic, classic stories, World War II, Roman gladiators, and your job is to help that boy to make that story more vivid, more evocative. The rare boy, the unusual boy who's writing stories about bringing weapons to school to kill other students, that's very unusual, but when that happens, that's grounds for urgent intervention.
So how can you help unmotivated boys or, underachieving young men? Is there a solution? Are there suggestions you have?
Well, sure. It depends. First of all, you want to determine which of these factors is in play. Sometimes the problem is that this is a boy who cares more about video games than he does about doing well in school. That's increasingly common in the United States, where more and more boys are now spending 20 hours a week playing video games. And we have very good evidence, which I present, that when boys spend more than 6 hours, when any kid spends more than 6 hours a week playing video games, their school performance suffers, and it's pretty linear. If you spend 20 hours a week, your school performance is going to suffer a lot on average. And when you look at who's spending 20 hours a week playing violent video games like Call of Duty, Grand Theft Auto, you find that boys outnumber girls by more than 8 to 1. So this is kind of more of a boys' issue than a girls' issue. But parents need to limit, govern, and guide what kids are doing with video games. And yet a lot of American parents have no clue what their son is doing. He's in his bedroom with the door closed, and he has a video game console in the bedroom. So recommendation number one, no screens in the bedroom. That's not just my opinion. That's the official guideline of the American Academy of Pediatrics. No screens in the bedroom, no cell phones in the bedroom, no video game consoles in the bedroom, and no screen time until the chores are done and the homework is done. So, again, that book is full of very practical recommendations based in evidence that I've seen have a real impact. You know, I'm a practicing physician.
Let me take one of the other topic areas, prescription drugs. This is an underreported portion of this. I watched a documentary on this topic recently. Just the ubiquity of ADHD diagnoses and it seems the disposition of school districts and even medical professionals to want to drug the enthusiasm, vibrancy out of kids, boys in particular. Talk to us about prescription drugs and the problem that over-medication of children presents.
Oh, absolutely. So a American boy is 14 times more likely to be on medication for ADHD compared with a British boy. And the United Kingdom is an outlier among European countries. I wrote a book for a French publisher titled Pourquoi les garçons perdent pied, les filles se mettent en danger, about girls and boys in France, using French data in collaboration with French colleagues. And I learned that in all of France, there are fewer than 6,000 kids on medication for attention deficit disorder. There are more kids in Chicago on medication for ADHD than there are in all of France, a nation of 65 million people. Why is this? The diagnosis of ADHD for boys has increased 20-fold since 1979. The proportion of kids who are on medication for ADHD is 20 times higher than it was in 1979. Why did that happen? And how can you tell if your son truly has ADHD? I talked with my publisher on this because they really didn't want me to include these very specific guidelines about how to determine whether your kid has ADHD or not. And my publisher said, are you suggesting that a parent, after reading your book, one book, is qualified to question the judgment of a board-certified child psychiatrist? And I said, absolutely. I said that parent must question the judgment of the child psychiatrist because in the United States, child psychiatrists are about 14 times more likely to make this diagnosis than child psychiatrists outside of North America.
And is this why is that? Is that just the impetus of big business, drug companies influencing doctors and?
Yeah, there's multiple factors going on that are in many ways uniquely American. So, for example, American kids are getting much less sleep than they were getting 20 years ago. Excuse me. That's not true of kids in the United Kingdom. It is true of kids here. And sleep deprivation perfectly mimics attention deficit disorder. This kid is not paying attention in class, and the parents go to the child psychiatrist and says, well, look at the report from the school. He's not paying attention in any class. How about if we try Adderall or Vyvanse and see if it helps? And the medication is tremendously helpful, but the kid's having side effects. So they bring him to me for a second opinion. And I ask the kid, okay, do you have a video game console in your bedroom? Okay, you do. When do you usually get to bed? Around 2 in the morning, and sometimes later, and you try to get up at 6? So you're going to school on 4 hours sleep day after day? What's Adderall? What's Vyvanse? They're amphetamines. They compensate for the sleep deprivation. So, yeah, they're tremendously helpful, but the appropriate remedy for sleep deprivation is sleep, not Schedule II stimulants. And this is pretty well understood outside of North America, I find. And I've met with families across England, Scotland, Australia, New Zealand, where it's really quite unusual to find that kids are allowed to have any device in the bedroom. But in this country, it's very common for kids to have a video game console in the bedroom, a television in the bedroom, a mobile phone in the bedroom. Don't do that.
Well, our mobile phone, though, that's their alarm clock. But now I'm going to have to start changing things at the Jacobson household.
Yeah,
I'm just going to have to
Tell
get
parents buy an
the
actual
old-fashioned
alarm clock.
I know.
Yes,
I'm going to have to buy an actual clock.
They still have those. I'll let you borrow my Hawk Harrelson alarm
Oh,
clock.
yeah.
He is Dr. Leonard Sachs. He's a medical doctor, family physician, and psychologist, also a PhD. The book, Boys Adrift, The 5 Factors Driving the Growing Epidemic of Unmotivated Boys and Underachieving Young Men. Dr. Sachs, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks again. Bye-bye.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.